And so we see these high rates of psychopathology labels in our kids, right? So we see autism spectrum disorder in non-Duchenne kids, right, is about 1.7% of the normative population. Major depression is about 3.2. And this is like, you know, across the, up until 18. Any anxiety disorder prevalence at any time, about 7.1%, ADHD, 9.4 to 11, depending on study, OCD, 1 to 3, and oppositional defiance disorder has a very big range because it's one of those disorders that's kind of like a lot more subjective in how people kind of, where they bucket those constellations of behavior. And so sometimes kids are, you know, lumped into that ADHD group if they're oppositional, and sometimes it's oppositional, and sometimes it's anxious. And so it tends to have a wider range of how people kind of conceptualize oppositional behavior. So there's a wider range, wiggle space in there. But in our Duchenne population, we see autism diagnoses up to 21%, and we see anxiety and depression up to 27%, and we see ADHD up to 32%, and we see OCD up to 5%, and we see oppositional disorder hover about 15% across average. And so when we're looking at this, we should all be like, oh, yikes, what is going on with our boys? And I have worked with these boys long enough that I don't think that they're the most unlucky kids in the world. I don't think they have Duchenne and then 4 or 5 standalone mental health conditions. I think when you look at these lists of our most common diagnosed behavioral concerns, a lot of these have one thing in common, is that they're disorders of emotional overwhelm or overflow in a lot of ways. So they're not those more psychiatric presentations. They're not those more sort of life sort of reactional type things. These are very much related to oftentimes brain dysfunction and or physiological dysfunction, right? So we should be stepping back and saying, what is it about Duchenne then, maybe, that makes our boys more vulnerable to being classified with these diagnoses? And then maybe if it's this prevalent, is this simply due to Duchenne, or do they all have standalone separate mental health conditions that they would have if they did not have Duchenne? And I think often they would not, right? So then we're saying, is this a neurodevelopmental disease along with a muscular disease? And I advocate and argue that it is. And if we look at it that way, right, then a lot of the things that people experience, we could say like, oh yeah, they're all very similar, kind of on a spectrum, right? So the Duchenne spectrum of behavior, I think, is how we need to be thinking about this, because we do, and we are seeing some very real shared experiences, as you all know.